Welcome to the Leadership for Society program at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. I'm Professor Brian Lowry, and the theme of this quarter's interview series is the intersection of public and private leadership. And today I'm talking to Professor Larry Diamond. Thanks, Professor Diamond, for joining us.
Thank you, Brian. It's good to be with you. You asked me to introduce myself, so I'm a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. I lead programs on democracy in Taiwan, U.S. Competition with China, digital democracy, and of course, I'm very involved now in thinking about how to reform and defend American democracy.
Yeah, and you've had quite a history of this too. You also were in Iraq helping think about building democratic institutions there. You've done quite a bit more in terms of building democracy or helping get democracy established around the world. Fantastic. So I want to just ask you a question about how you're thinking about democracy now. There's a lot of questions about the current state of democracy actually around the world. What do you see as the biggest leadership challenges right now for democracy, both globally and here in the US? What are the biggest challenges from your perspective?
Well, I think in some ways they're unfortunately similar between the international environment and the US. I'll deal with the international one first. I think that the wave of democratization that got going in the late 70s and uh, increased in the 1980s and peaked in the early 1990s, has long since given way to a kind of what I've called a democratic recession of rising autocracy, receding democracy, and the increasing power of certainly the world's leading autocracy, China, but others as well. Russia, somewhat resurgent now and increasingly aggressive as it has invaded Ukraine and pressured its other European and post-Soviet neighbors, and the Gulf states in their own way as they're modernizing. And then countries that were once democratic, Venezuela, moving to authoritarianism in the early 2000s, Turkey not long after, Hungary 2010. So we have this wave of democracy giving way to autocracy. And we have not done a very good job of countering it, the established democracies of the world. We did have some significant flows of assistance to support Democrats around the world, democratic processes, democratic elections, democratic organizations, civil society, business communities. But now, in the current administration of Donald Trump, those are all being closed down and terminated. So I think that's a serious problem globally when you remove the United States from the picture of democratic advocacy, democratic promotion of free institutions and ideas, democratic flows of alternative information through the Voice of America and so on. So that's the international picture. It's one in which autocracy is on the march and democracy is in retreat. Then, when you talk about the United States, I think the two dominant phenomenon are a long period of increasing polarization in the United States on partisan lines and loss of trust, loss of bipartisanship in the Congress, loss of mutual respect and tolerance, a degradation of our political culture. And then most recently, with the return of President Trump to the presidency, a more dedicated assault coming from the president himself and his key allies on democratic norms, institutions, practices, and restraints, due process, the rule of law, the independence of institutions that are necessary to ensure a democracy and rule of law state.
Mhm. So, one of the things that you highlighted is the connection between what's happening globally and what's happening in the United States. And so, I think often we think of the United States as exceptional, and by that I mean unique, actually. Um, but given that this is happening globally, what do you think is pushing this trend? Do you think it's a number of factors that are happening simultaneously, kind of around the world, or how do we understand why we're entering, as you call it, a democratic recession?
Well, I think there are some factors that are definitely global. The most global one is that social media has risen in the past 2 decades to become um, the dominant form of communication, and certainly a very important means by which political communication happens, political campaigns happens, and a growing uh, source of political or politically relevant news for individuals. And we know that social media is configured in such a way in its business model to reward outrage and shock, anger, and emotion rather than rational discussion and the boring kind of truth about what's happening. And so this has, I think, been everywhere, every single place, a contributor to a degradation of the political culture, to rising distrust and intolerance and increasing political polarization, even to the point of intergroup violence. So that's one thing that countries across the board, Europe, the United States, Asia, emerging market countries, advanced industrial countries, it's one thing they have in common. I think if you look, Brian, at the advanced industrial democracies of Europe and the United States and the impact of globalization in terms of trade liberalization, promoting deindustrialization, and in terms of pressures of immigration and the feeling of established communities of kind of being under assault or under threat or kind of losing their cultural preeminence. That's been a common factor driving illiberal populism in, for example, Germany, Italy, France, Britain, Spain, Poland, Hungary, and the United States. So there's that as well. And I think the challenge is not to do away with globalization. It's certainly, in my view, in a substantive sense, not the kind of indiscriminate tariffs that President Trump has opposed, nor is it to completely halt immigration, which I think we very much need, both lower skilled workers and high skilled workers. But we do need a little bit more intentionality in, I'd say, managing the flows of immigration. And I think populations are clearly saying in Europe and the United States, more control of borders. The third thing I'll mention, I don't want to go on too long, but I think there is another um, common feature here across borders. While inequality between nations has diminished in the last, say, 3 decades with globalization and, the rise of some emerging market countries, most of all China, but now India and others in Latin America, Asia and Africa, and so on. Inequality within nations has increased almost everywhere. And I think as the economic distance between not just the haves, but the have muches and the have-nots intensifies, and economic insecurity becomes more severe, economic displacement and the decline of job prospects and retirement security for a lot of the traditional working and middle classes in, say, Europe and the United States. This has also, I think, been a factor feeding polarization and political anxiety.
Hmm. You know what? One of the things that strikes me is that all three of these things have an interesting intersection with public and private leadership. So you think about social media and the control of information. That you what you could argue that social media is now a privatization of the spread of information, where at some points it was, there was maybe in some countries in particular more government involvement in providing what people might think of as non-biased information, like a BBC or an NPR, these sorts of things. Trade liberalization, same. Immigration, there's a need for labor. So people are coming in, but then there's a response in the public to that and how the government manages those inflows and outflows of people, depending on which nations we're talking about. And also within nation inequality, you could argue, is again a feature of the markets in which we exist. So I say all that to ask, how do you think about the role of private leadership or the private sector in helping manage the democratic, I guess I'll call it backsliding?
So I think there are multiple dimensions to this question. Um, Maybe for the moment, I'll divide it into the spheres of normal politics and abnormal or emergency politics. So the sphere of normal politics is how do we how do we fashion broadly consensual and viable or effective policy responses to the challenges we face. And I think that private leadership, let's say from the business sector and civil society, has not been particularly effective at coming together and kind of trying to build coalitions from the center out to deal with these challenges. I think that is possible. I think if you poll the American public, you find that there are, reasonable policy compromises that people can embrace. We did a deliberative poll on, a lot of the issues confronting the American public before the 2020 campaign, including immigration, taxes and the economy, healthcare, and so on. And once people had a chance to deliberate this was done by what is now called the Deliberative Democracy Lab at Stanford, led by Professor James Fishkin. Once people had a chance to deliberate and be exposed to, you know, balanced and objective information, pro and con, on different policy alternatives, they tended to converge toward not a pure consensus, but some parameters that you could identify of what could be sustainable majority policies that would combine, for example, on immigration, increases in high-skilled immigration, which we really need, and in low-skilled immigration to fill some of the gaps we have, say, in agricultural work and some areas with more control over borders. In other words, some of what Trump is trying to do now to just say, we have borders, we should have a big door for people to come in and work here, but we should also have a system that manages who comes in, who's allowed to come in, and who doesn't. So that's just one among many examples where I think we can find common ground. I would say private leadership uh, not only in the business sector, but in other civil spheres, universities, religious institutions, associations of various kinds. They have not had the will, the means, the imagination to, try and develop initiatives to transcend our partisan polarization and see if we could find some common ground on these issues. And as a result, we're very polarized and we're very dysfunctional in terms of finding uh, common ground on these policy questions. And as a result of dysfunctionality, we're more polarized. And it's a constant feedback loop between inaction and dysfunctionality in terms of our formal political institutions, essentially the Congress and the White House, on the one hand, and political polarization, political distrust, political disillusionment on the other. So that's the normal politics. It's not pretty, but it does fall into the realm of the conventional political system. The abnormal politics we're in now is that we have, for the first time, I think, in American history, a president who seems to be intent on dismantling the rule of law, dismantling checks and balances, eviscerating um, independent scrutiny of his actions and his administrative actions by firing all the inspectors general of different government agencies, ravaging the professional career meritocratic civil service, intimidating the judiciary, the political opposition, even from within his own party, and just generally concentrating and weaponizing executive power to a degree that we certainly have never seen in peacetime. And so this is abnormal politics. It's an abnormal situation. I think it's an increasingly urgent situation, and we haven't seen much in the way of a coherent, not to mention forthright or courageous response from private leaders. I think they're all uh, pretty much hoping that the storm will pass and that if there's going to be any victimization, it will be visited on somebody other than them and their business or their organization. And history tells us that's not a very smart approach in the face of a creeping authoritarian project.
Hmm. I want to lean into the question about leaders of private industry. So you could argue, and it's arguable, but we're sliding towards something that looks a little bit like oligarchy, where you have people who have tremendous amount of resources that that translates into voice. And the question I'm gonna political voice, that is, they can control the means of communication and can insert their opinions as they see fit. I just wonder, how does democracy deal with that, right? So we have voice. You don't want to limit people's voice. Some people have more resources than others, but how do you prevent that from sliding into something like system capture, where I have so many resources that now I can turn the system to what I perceive to be my interests?
Well, um, this is challenging because we live in a capitalist system. Elon Musk has the right to buy Twitter, right? I think it's unfortunate that it was sold to someone who had such an intense political agenda. And I think it bespeaks a certain kind of hypocrisy that there had been such a condemnation of uh, the social media moguls who were said to have political agendas, and then suddenly someone with a more blatant and a freely advertised political agenda buys one of the most important social media platforms, converts it into a more overt political instrument, and there's just nothing but enthusiasm from the other side. But that's the world we're in, and until and unless the Congress removes the exemption for social media in Section 230 of the Federal Communications Act. um, you know, we live in the world we live in, and so you can only counter this type of phenomenon with alternative mechanisms of, you know, social media channels, alternative mechanisms of influencing, and so on. Um, I think that there's two things going on here. One is that, yes, we've always had in the kind of modern age of American democracy, with the rise of mass communications like mass newspapers and then radio, television, and so on, a certain openness to oligopoly in influence over communications, and people like William Randolph Hearst owning newspapers. I mean, how different is that from the Twitter sphere now? It is in terms of the character of the communication platform, but it's not in terms of the power and control element with married to a political agenda of a fabulously wealthy individual. So, and we've always had anti-oligopolistic tendencies that surface as a counter and a check in our political system. So I'm concerned about this, and I think part of the answer is that people don't like this, need to more effectively organize their responses and their technologies. The people who are pressing the agenda that goes along with this have been more technically and tactically proficient, and you can't blame them for just doing a better job than people say coming from the progressive side. There is a respect in which it's a competitive marketplace in information, and one side, I think, in the last decade has been demonstrably better at it than the other side. There's a second dimension to this, of course, which you were hinting at, as in terms of a public policy dimension, which is that over the last 2 decades, the percentage of wealth in and income in the United States, particularly wealth, captured by the top 1/10 of 1%, has increased pretty dramatically. And of course, with that goes increased political power. We could
Hmm.
change that with the tax system.
Hmm. I was going to ask, not about the tax system in particular, but we talk often about a marketplace of ideas, but there's some ideas that we put outside of um, appropriate conversation, right? So we have in the Constitution some attempt to enshrine minority rights, right? So there's some things that we wouldn't let just be left up to a majority decision. Do you think that we're approaching a place where that needs to be rethought and reconsidered the way we're managing what is allowable in the marketplace of ideas?
Well, we are struggling with this in the universities all the time, right? At what point freedom of speech and academic freedom bump up against the minimal norms of tolerance and mutual respect? You you have the right as a student, a professor, whatever, to express whatever view you want. You don't have the right under Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act to create a hostile environment for a particular racial, ethnic, or nationality community. And in fact, the reverse is true. Universities have an obligation under Title VI and the discrimination and harassment reporting system that we have now at Stanford University that's been put in place this year is very explicitly a Title VI reporting system. So universities have an obligation to respond to incidents like this, particularly when it risks creating a hostile environment for members of the group. And so we have to navigate around this. Should we tolerate a neo-Nazi group marching in Peoria with their Nazi symbols and slogans? And when was it, the 1960s or something like that? Well, I think there's a consensus in American jurisprudence that they have a right to articulate even hateful and odious sentiments in a public square. Should they have the right to do that on a social media platform? Um, my view is no. I have a different view of the First Amendment than some other people. And I think that social media companies should have some minimal standards. They're private companies to enforce minimal principles of tolerance and to remove hateful content that particularly could lead to violence or active discrimination. But it's a very fine line. You know, where does the line? Where do you cross the line from hate speech into nasty and controversial, but legitimate free expression rights? I
Mhm.
think the boundary isn't necessarily the same on a social media website as it would be in the public square. But, and I think it might be different in universities, but the Supreme Court has interpreted the First Amendment in pretty expansive terms.
Mm. I'm curious about the you would have an exemption for social media. Why would you think it's different than any other public square? Why do you think it's different?
Because it's a privately owned company, and it's not necessarily a public space. And I think they have, and also the virality and volume of it, I think has different consequences for civil society, democracy, and public space than the ability to just, you know, say something in a physical public square.
Mm. You know, this makes me think as the world is changing, right? So we have social media now. There's a lot of conversation about AI and um, what's coming there. And this is why, again, I wonder, are the systems that we have set up, I think I know your answer to this, sufficient to deal with the world that's coming? And if not, um, how do we prepare ourselves to maintain the kind of democracy we've had in the world we're in and the world that's coming? Like I'm just, given what you're saying, I don't leave this feeling optimistic about the future.
Well, I think we're facing uh, a number of intersecting, intertwining, formidable challenges. The answer is not to, you know, yield to despair, but to take them seriously, thoughtfully, and imaginatively. I think there's a general sense in the body politic of the United States and certainly in the business community that Europe has gone too far in regulating social media and AI. But you know, I can't believe that the answer is no regulation at all, right? And on the one hand, if you overregulate, you lose certainly your competitive advantage or potential competitive position in the development of AI. We're in an existential race in that regard. We want to be careful about that. But if there's no regulation at all, no standard setting, and no oversight, we risk losing our democracy in a different way. So I'm not a specialist on this, but I am deeply worried about it. And you're asking about private leadership. I think the overarching question that runs through the whole conversation is what responsibility do private sector leaders have to democracy and to society to exercise some sense of responsibility and concern for the community, even when, or maybe especially when, there's no kind of overbearing government authority or law that's compelling them to do so. If you don't want intrusive government regulation, some sense of, some moral or ethical guidepost, some set of voluntary standards, some expression of commitment to the public good uh, becomes one useful way of preempting the welling up of sentiment for regulation that may go overboard and be counterproductive.
Mhm. No, I see that, and I also see it as a collective action problem, though, because if you're in a particular space, and your competitors are not behaving in that way, you put yourself at a disadvantage in the current system by
Yep.
engaging in that on your own. So this is in part why there exists like regulations imposed by the public to help solve what it could be seen as just a collective action problem. And so
Well,
I
let me put it this way.
Mhm.
That is certainly true. And that's why, in the end, I think this problem is only going to be solved with regulation. But Mark Zuckerberg did not need to completely or nearly completely decimate the ranks of his content moderation force at Facebook. That's a decision he made in response to a perception of the political environment that he had. And I don't think, Facebook was at risk of political extinction if he had made a different decision.
That's true. I'll push back and say though that he saw that perhaps I mean obviously neither one of us are in his head, but he saw the political benefit of seeming to be on the side of what he saw as
Yeah,
a Trumpian wave or
yeah.
however he saw that. And so it still was a response to his perception of where the marketplace was.
Well, that's one way of framing it.
So here, ask one more question to ask at the end. There's a number of people who are future leaders, like our MBA students will go out into the world and create things and lead organizations. What would you leave them with, given your expertise?
Well, I think the fundamental problem we face in the kind of current or evolving system of American capitalism is short-term thinking, as driven by the constant framing of corporate performance and the performance of corporate leaders as what have you done for me lately in delivering returns to shareholders and in like pretty short term, even quarterly calculations. And we can't solve our societal problems. And I will even go further and say a lot of corporations may not be able to make the long term bets for global competitiveness that need to be made if we're always trapped in this short term thinking. And I think that TSMC has thrived as one of the most successful companies in the world in a democracy because it had a longer term logic to it. And a lot of Chinese companies now have the freedom to think in these longer term, over the horizon strategic ways as well. And both for the long term health of corporations that your graduates may be leading, but certainly for the long term health of the national environment in which most of their corporations will be registered and that they'll need to have the rule of law protection for. We just can't get there with the level of short term thinking and calculation that we now have. And so, how we refashion the incentive structure to enable us to think a little bit more deeply, a little bit more long term, and a little bit more in a manner that will enable corporations collectively and corporations together with other institutions to address the collective action problem you raise, I think is one of the most serious challenges we confront now, both for the defense of American democracy and for the preservation of America's economic and technological leadership in the world.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate taking time to talk to me and your insights on what's going on in the world and the US right now. Thank you so much.
Okay, Brian, thank you so much.